There are many arguments against the death penalty. It's not a deterrent against the crimes that it punishes. Society who use the death penalty don't have lower crime rates than those that do. When a country abolishes the death penalty, they are not plunged into criminal chaos. But even if the death penalty did reduce crime rates, would it then be acceptable? The death penalty targets the economically disadvantaged, those who can't afford good legal counsel, those without a voice in society. There's a saying in the US, capital punishment means that those without the capital get the punishment. Statistics show this is true. But would it be acceptable if people from all sections of society were executed? Does killing a rich man make killing a poor man right? The death penalty is irreversible and results in the death of innocence. When someone is dead, a retrospective pardon is of little use to them or their family. Since 1990, in China, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and the USA, there have been 51 recorded executions of child offenders, some as young as 14 years old. Even if no more innocents or children are killed, should we tolerate the death penalty? The death penalty is never acceptable. It abuses two of our most basic human rights. Everyone has the right to live, and no one shall be subject to torture. The death penalty obviously kills people, but it also tortures, physically by the brutal nature of execution, and psychologically by forcing individuals to wait to be killed. They wait, sometimes for decades, while others are led to their deaths. The horror of this waiting is unimaginable. Human rights are thus called because they apply to all human beings. They belong to all of us equally. An attack on these fundamental rights anywhere is an attack against all of us. The right to life is inalienable. It cannot be given, and it cannot be taken away. No matter how terrible the crime, in a world full of uncertainty, human rights are a clearly drawn line, a line between what is right and what is wrong, a line between imprisonment and execution. Every individual facing the death penalty is, whatever they stand accused of, still a human being. However much we revile them, however much we are outraged by their actions, however much we want revenge, they are still human beings. They may well have killed and tortured. They've crossed the line. But do we really want to join them?
And of course, who doesn't love to hear an argument made with a British accent? So anyway, there you go. Jeremy Irons on why that he is personally against the death penalty. So I thought it'd be interesting to sort of start today's lecture with that speech that he also, since a lot of the things that he picks up on in that argument are things that Stephen Nathanson talks about in his particular article against death penalty, against capital punishment. And that indeed is our topic today, looking at this particular argument that Stephen Nathanson has made against the death penalty. So who is Stephen Nathanson? Well, he's an important philosopher that has been at Johns Hopkins for several years, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, in the philosophy department there, as well as the philosophy department at Northeastern University in Boston. He's written a lot of books and a lot more articles on issues regarding the morality of war, about sort of practical elements of justice, as well as public policy, the kinds of public policy that he thinks fits best with our moral framework um, we should have about all kinds of issues, especially important legal issues. And his position on the death penalty, on capital punishment, is that it's wrong. really for two broad reasons. Because the theory itself is irrational. And what he means by irrational here is that the theory does not stand up to logical scrutiny. It's in a sense illogical. Okay. And his other broad reason is because if we look at the practice of how it's done, it's actually quite morally abhorrent, and we should be just morally outraged at how the death penalty is done in this country. So what I want to do today in this lecture is look at these two broad reasons and go over his specific arguments um, that argue for these particular reasons as to why he thinks the death penalty is wrong. So first of all, we'll look at his argument that, or his position rather, that in theory, the death penalty is incoherent, it's irrational, it's problematic. And first what he wants to do is look at the argument from deterrence. So let's just quickly review what this is, right? The argument from deterrence is an argument in favor of the death penalty. And remember, what it says is that we should have a policy of the death of having the death penalty because that deters people from becoming murderers. If they have to fear death, if they have to fear the possibility of being convicted and then put on death row and executed by the state, that fear would be enough to deter them from murdering other people. On the one hand, as Nathanson himself puts it, on the one hand, it's a powerful argument. Indeed, we fear all kinds of things. There's all kinds of events and situations that we don't want to put ourselves in. We think twice about them, and so we don't do it, right? Our behavior is deterred all the time from doing certain kinds of things because we don't want to suffer the consequences of those. Indeed, this is a huge impetus for utilitarianism, for the normative framework of utilitarianism itself, and why a lot of people think that utilitarianism is the way to think about normative morality, is because things like deterrence are very, very powerful. We all live by them. We are all deterred from all kinds of things. But regarding capital punishment, Nathanson thinks that this argument from deterrence is actually a really bad argument. He says it's false. Well, why? One reason why is because we can imagine all kinds of punishments that would actually have a greater deterrent effect on people than the death penalty. Nonetheless, doing those kinds of punishments would be wrong to do. It would be incredibly wrong to inflict. One example of that would be if we were to have a policy of punishment that executed or tortured the family members of those who committed murder. So instead of if I'm a murderer and if I'm considering becoming a murderer, I'm sitting around and thinking about it. Should I become a murderer or not? Uh, and if I was to have to worry not about myself being put on death row as a result of that, but my family being put on death row, right? If the law in this state were such that it wouldn't be just me going to prison, but my entire family would go to prison for my crimes. Oh my goodness, I think that would be a greater deterrent effect on me than merely worrying about myself. Why in the world would I want to bring down innocent people to pay for the sins that I have committed, right? Pay for the crimes that I have committed. That's just not good, to say the least, right? That would just be absolutely horrible to have to endure the anguish of that. So yeah, that would mean that, hey, I mean, this indeed would be a greater deterrent effect. So, I mean, the idea here is that, if deterrence is what matters, if that's the reason why we have the death penalty to begin with, then I guess the point that Nathanson's trying to make here then is that, well, we should do what indeed brings about the greatest deterrent effect. But would that be right? Would it be right to execute or torture one's family that wasn't even involved in the crime that was committed? So, well, and of course the answer is no, right? We find that completely unacceptable. So the point here that Nathanson's trying to make is that if your reason for holding to the death penalty is deterrence, I mean, if that's the core of it, if that's the core as to why you think the death penalty is morally appropriate even, and not just morally acceptable, but maybe even morally appropriate, something we should have. Well, remember that deterrence holds that what makes a punishment morally right is its deterrent effect. It's purely the consequences of it that make it right. if the death penalty deters people from killing other people, then it's morally right to have because it provides the best consequences. Executing or torturing an entire family of the person who's convicted of this, his family, her family, that might actually be even more deterrent. So again, utilitarianism, what the right thing to do is what provides the most amount of good for the most amount of people. So executing one's entire family might be that which provides the most amount of good for the most amount of people. So utilitarianism would almost seemingly then hold us to this new kind of punishment now. But we find that incredibly unacceptable, don't we? It just doesn't seem right to say that other people should suffer for the crimes that they did not commit, even if that would provide a greater deterrent. So this argument from deterrence, we can think of cases then, we can think of particular examples that show sort of how problematic then the argument itself is. Well, but Nathanson knows that some people are going to pipe up and say that, this is a made up example that no one really supports. I mean, the death penalty is about executing guilty people. Of course, no one would just go for whatever is the greatest deterrent, right? We have to just sort of settle for this. And of course, Nathanson responds and says, yes, but at the same time, it's already the case that innocent people are declared guilty and executed. It rarely happens, but it happens. So if it's already the price that we pay, what does it matter if a few more innocent people die in order to deter future murderers? We might say that their lives have been sacrificed. We'll chalk it up to human error. At the same time, we'll try to look at a positive side of it. Even if a few innocent people die, right? Even that will reverberate throughout the community and maybe encourage people to really get in line, to really stop their criminal activity. If it's going to be no hold barred and we're just going to start executing people left and right who have anything even remotely close to do with homicide, then maybe they'll get the message, right? Of course, again, we think that that's problematic. So if deterrence is all that matters, what Nathanson claims is that we're really logically committed to do whatever it takes to deter future murders. But again, right, most of us are going to say, well, no, it's too high of a price to pay. It's not the case that we should be committed to do whatever it takes to deter murders, because doing whatever it takes is really sort of a blank check. It's whatever it takes. And executing innocent people, torturing innocent people who have had nothing to do with the crimes, that's a step too far. That really goes against our moral intuition. So for these reasons, right, they're really this particular reason, Nathanson thinks that the argument from deterrence is a bad one. Well, what about the argument from justice and desert? So this would be the more sort of Kantian duty argument, that is that we have a duty to execute justice, and so people ought to pay for their crimes. They ought to pay the punishment for their crimes. Indeed, that is proportionate to the crimes that they committed. So if they steal $500, they ought to make restitution, let's say, and then pay a $500 penalty. If they kill somebody, then they themselves then ought to be killed as punishment. So this is the idea of the argument from justice and desert. That indeed, as a society, we have a duty to bring about retribution upon people for the crimes that they commit, and that retribution should be proportionate to the crimes that they did commit. So oftentimes, people will talk about this in terms of sort of the old traditional concept of eye for an eye. This is the belief that punishment indeed should equal the crime. It shouldn't be cruel or unusual. It shouldn't be go beyond what it is that the crime shouldn't go beyond the crime that was committed. In other words, we would think that it would be pretty inappropriate for someone who shoplifted a $20 watch to get the death penalty for that, right? At the same time, and I've used this example before, we would think it would be inappropriate for someone to be slapped with merely a $100 fine and 30 days of community service for committing mass murder on an elementary school. Okay, again, right, it's completely disproportionate there. So eye for an eye is the idea that the punishment itself should fit the crime. Nathanson notes that even if we think this is right and we're going to try to cash this out in terms of a social policy, there's three problems with it. Three problems that we really need to deal with and try to get a sense of in order to really understand what's going on. Point number one, he says, is that it's just barbarism for barbarism. That is, what he means here is that if one of the reasons we have the death penalty is because that's the most proportionate kind of punishment to exact out on somebody who's committed homicide, all we're doing is following their barbaric act with another barbaric act, not doing the intelligent, civilized, mature thing here. We're bringing ourselves down to the level of this particular criminal, of this killer. This is one of the points that Jeremy Irons made in that short video earlier, right? That surely, these people are awful or evil. People who commit homicide, they have indeed crossed the line. But do we want to join them, right? Does that mean that we have to join them by more or less bringing ourselves down to their level and doing to them what they've done to other people? So, obviously, different people are going to have a different intuition about this. But this is Nathanson's point on this, right? He thinks that the death penalty is really just a barbaric act and that we can do better than that. Second point here that he sees really show a problem with the argument from justice and desert. That is, from somebody getting what they deserve, is deserving to die for committing a crime here, is that it conflicts with our beliefs about the role and justification of punishment. And it's something to really think about if you've ever thought about it. I think as a kid I thought about it because I got in a lot of trouble. So even then, here I am thinking about sort of the philosophy of punishment. What's the point of punishment? Why do we do punishment? Is it just to make us feel better? Is it just because it's something we've always done? And I think if you sit down and think about it, historically anyway, why we do punishment of all kinds with kids or criminals or cheaters, college student cheaters. Don't you guys ever dare cheat on anything? It's because we believe that punishment itself has a really close connection to the idea of discipline, and that what punishment does is it has a redemptive aspect to it that makes people better, that disciplines them to be better, that brings about a growth or a maturity through the punishment. So it has this really redemptive character to it, if I could just put it that way. And I think even historically, as a society, we've come to believe that. We think that that's the case. I've mentioned this before, I think in another lecture. That's the reason why, for instance, we've changed the names of our prisons from penitentiaries to correctional facilities. We don't want to think of them anymore as places where people go to do nothing but sit around and think about their crimes and suffer the mental anguish of that. No, we think about them now and have named them correctional facilities, places where people will go get corrected. They're places for people to rethink their lives, try to figure out a trade or even get a college degree or something there, turn their life around so that when they're released, or if they're released, they can actually become taxpayers and start paying the state back for all the money we spent on them in prison. Or other things, right? I mean, this is the idea, is to make a more productive person through punishment and merely just to torture or kill them, if I want to put it that way. So this eye for an eye stuff really does then, he thinks, conflict with our understanding of punishment as discipline, as growth, as maturity. The death penalty obviously does not do, obviously goes against that because it's a death penalty. There's no correction happening, right? We're just ending the life of the convicted killer. And the third reason he gives here for why he thinks the argument from justice and desert is a bad argument is because it in and of itself really provides no guidance for determining what an appropriate punishment is in all cases. Um, so let's give some examples of that. How do you apply this concept of eye for an eye in all cases? Think about terrorism. How do you apply eye for an eye punishment there? Someone comes and terrorizes our country. Do we go and terrorize that person's country when their country is probably innocent of what this guy is doing? Doesn't seem to make sense. Or do we terrorize this guy that came and did the terrorism? That would seem to be a little bit weird. How do you terrorize a terrorist? Maybe tie him up to a pole in the back of a farm wagon and drag him through a haunted hayride or something. I mean, I don't know how you how do you do that? What about rape? Right? If someone is convicted of rape, then what's the eye for an eye punishment there? Right? Rape that person? That seems a little bit weird. Or theft, right? If somebody steals something, then what's eye for an eye there? Do you steal from them? I guess in a sense, maybe a fine would be something like that, where you're kind of stealing from them, or at least you're forcing them to pay. So maybe that kind of works there. What about drug possession? How do you do eye for an eye there if somebody's got drugs on them? Um, what's eye for an eye there? I mean, this is the problem with eye for an eye, and that Nathanson's trying to point out is that it's not really applicable universally across the board here. So it provides problems for trying to figure out what an appropriate punishment is. Another way to think about that too is think about eye for an eye. Even if we were to say that eye for an eye, well, at least it works for murder. It makes sense for murder. Nathanson's like, okay, let's say that it does, just for the sake of it. But what kind of punishment is gonna best fit a criminal, given the kind of way that they committed their murder? What if this criminal hired somebody to kill their wife? What if this murderer didn't actually do it himself, but he hired somebody to murder his wife? Well, then what do you do there? You hire somebody to kill him. Um, it's kind of tricky. What about if someone's convicted of vehicular homicide because they were driving down Main Street here in town, drunk as a skunk monkey, and a pedestrian walks out in front of the car and gets killed? Do we then, just throw somebody or throw this convicted murderer out in the middle of the road and uh, I don't know, down a fifth of whiskey and just take off behind the wheel and just run them down? Then I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm sure there are people that volunteer for that. Um, what if somebody dies because an arsonist set fire to an abandoned house? Well, that arsonist is convicted of murder. What do we do then? How do we do eye for an eye there? Do we throw that guy into a house and light it on fire and let him die that way? Um, that seems a little bit barbaric. Although I wouldn't doubt it if a lot of people say, "Well, yeah, that's exactly what we'll do. That's how we'll execute him in that sense." Right. So, I mean, these are the kinds of problems that are raised when it comes to trying to universalize or trying to get the bottom of these principles and see how consistent they are with themselves. And they don't seem to be very consistent with themselves. Deterrence and eye for an eye seem to have lots of problems with them when we analyze them. That's Nathanson's point. And that's why he calls um, these theoretical arguments like deterrence and like justice and desert. That's why he calls them irrational for these reasons. Well, what about the death penalty in practice then? Right? How does that work? Why is that so problematic? Well, Nathanson thinks that in practice, the death penalty is not justifiable, that we ought not to have it as a social policy. First of all, because it's inconsistent with the value of justice. And oh my, do we value justice in our country? Uh, oh my, do we go crazy, as we ought to, when injustice happens, when people are taken advantage of, or when people are found guilty of crimes they didn't commit. Um, uh, this is the sort of thing that we're very, very get animated over when injustice happens. So indeed, we do value justice. and our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence and all other documents and the trajectory of our political life is geared towards justice, whether or not we actually know what it is, we're deceived about it or whatever, and we value it. Okay? That's all I'm trying to say here. Well, what is the kind of what are the kinds of things that a justice system ought to be able to do? Right? If we value justice, what do we want our court systems, our justice systems, our judges and juries, everyone who's involved, especially in criminal justice, if we want to put it that way? What are all the things involved that we want people involved with criminal justice to be able to do? Well, Nathanson thinks that there's at least two things that we need our justice system to be able to do, if indeed we do value justice. Number one is they need to be able to separate those who are guilty from those who are innocent of committing crimes. That's a very basic point. The procedures um, and all of the things, the processes that go on in our justice system, they need to be geared towards achieving the norms of being able to identify who's guilty and identify who's innocent. Okay. Other side of that coin, Nathanson thinks we also need our justice system, if we value justice, we need that system to be able to differentiate between the worst criminals among us from those who are not so much. So we need to be able to separate the psychopaths and the sociopaths and those who are just pure evil, um, as well as those who are so narcissistic and into themselves, they're willing to do whatever it takes to benefit themselves, whether killing or stealing or torturing or whatever. So we need to be able to identify and sort out those from those who commit lesser crimes, from those who aren't really bad people, but do things that are indeed against the law every now and then. We need to be able to distinguish these kinds of things. And what Nathanson argues is that the justice system in the United States is incredibly unreliable on both of these counts, on one and two. And the reason why is because when we look at how justice is done, and by justice here, in this case, I mean just practically through our court systems and our justice systems, justice is done in a manner such that features that are irrelevant to the crimes, features that are irrelevant to adjudicating the crimes, to trying the cases, to setting out punishments for those that are declared guilty, all of these things, features that are irrelevant to all that matter way too much. They have way more influence and predictive power than they ought to have. What are some of these things? Well, one of them is race. Nathanson cites all kinds of data. Some of it's fairly old, but the interesting thing is that the data is not that much different now from this that he's citing, and I've seen a little bit of it recently in a few studies. And what we know is that race itself is an incredibly important factor in terms of being able to predict who will get the death penalty or not for the same kind of crime. So a couple of statistics that Nathanson cites, and of course he cites a lot, a couple I think that are kind of sum up the point he's trying to make, are these two. When you look at the data between 1976 and 1996, over a 20-year period, 83% of those executed in the United States were charged with the murder of a white victim. In that same period, only 1% of executions were imposed on a white person who had killed a black victim. The flip side of that data then is that the vast majority of people who are executed are African American, black. Um, so the question we have to ask then is why is that the case? It's not because white people don't kill people. That's not the case at all. Um, if you actually look at some of the data and look at where charges are brought about and where uh, life imprisonment is um, is noted, um, it's a lot more even, okay, across the board racially. Here we're talking about specifically who gets the death penalty. So in the majority, the vast majority of cases regarding white defendants, they if found guilty, they more often than not, get life imprisonment sentences. But for black defendants, right, there's a much higher rate among them of getting the death penalty, of being sent to death row for their crime of murder. A second irrelevant feature, according to Nathanson, that he points out regarding the death penalty is socioeconomic status. What we know is that people who are in the lower classes regarding the socioeconomic rung of our society, right? In other words, they're poor, don't have a lot of money whatsoever. They are more, if they are a defendant in a murder trial, they are way more likely to, if found guilty, to get the death penalty than those who have more money. But one statistic that Nathanson notes is that in the state of Georgia, the defendants classified as having a low socioeconomic status were 230% times more likely, or 2.3 times more likely, to receive a death sentence than defendants who had a higher status, who made more money, or who at least reported more money on their income tax returns, right? That's crazy. Why should having money matter here? And that's sort of the third point, or it ties into this third point here, which is the quality of legal representation. This is an irrelevant factor that involves that, or that is way too influential in who gets the death penalty and not. Because if, according to Nathanson, because if you don't have money, then you're having a harder time hiring a lawyer that is competent at being able to defend you and handle your case. What the data shows is that defendants who have court-appointed attorneys, and what is a court-appointed attorney? Well, that's a lawyer that a judge will appoint for you um, uh, to handle your case for you, to represent you and defend you if you don't have the money to hire your own. So if you can't hire your own, the state indeed will pay for one to represent you. Of course, here's a trick to that. And I got to be careful because some of you might know court-appointed attorneys very well. It's not so much necessarily that court-appointed attorneys stink at their job, but court-appointed attorneys have an incredibly high caseload, and they don't have the luxury of being paid the big bucks to just focus on your case and then take another one after your case is completed or finished. They have to handle a lot of cases all at once. They're stretched very thin. We know that's the case in our system. So defendants, the statistics show that defendants who have court-appointed attorneys defending them are 2.6 times more likely, 260% times more likely to receive the death penalty than those who are able to spend the big bucks and get big, important, flashy, very good attorneys to defend them. It really shouldn't matter. A good case should be a good case. A good attorney should be an attorney. But unfortunately, because everybody, the idea about attorneys are all after the same thing. We ought to get to the truth and show if there's reasonable doubt that this person being charged crime actually committed their crime. The truth of the matter is, some attorneys are just better than others in making this case to a jury. And the ones who are good at it are able to demand the big money to do that for their clients. And that's just the truth of it. The 1999 Chicago Tribune study, the Chicago Tribune being a newspaper in Chicago, Illinois, found that 33 people sentenced to death had lawyers that were later disbarred or suspended due to poor performance. Not poor performance necessarily regarding those particular death penalty cases, but over a lifetime of a career, and these were all court-appointed attorneys. Again, they're stretched thin and not able to do what they would like to be able to do for their clients. This is a problem. So here's what Nathanson concludes from all of this. If we value justice, and that is, this is what he concludes when it comes to the death penalty in practice here and how we actually practice it. If we value justice, then we must do away with the death penalty, since irrelevant factors influence who get it and who doesn't. Race, money, and the quality of the lawyer play way too huge a part, too big of a part and who gets sent to death row and who doesn't. So if we value justice, then we need to do away with. All right, one more point then that he gives regarding the practice of the death penalty. So not only if we value justice, then we should do away with it. Thus, right, it's not only inconsistent with the value of justice. Secondly, Nathanson says it's inconsistent with the value of human life. Having the death penalty goes against being any kind of pro-life. If this is pretty much what he's saying, is that if you consider yourself a pro-life person, if you consider yourself thinking that the value of human life itself is absolute, then you indeed have to be against the death penalty. Here's why that's the case, he thinks anyway, is because if indeed we cared about human life, first of all, we wouldn't be okay with the status quo of all this stuff. We wouldn't appoint poor lawyers in these cases. We would be much more concerned about investing all kinds of money, time, and care into the cases of these people. We would maybe even want to raise taxes so that more lawyers could be hired on behalf of these defendants so that they could get a better shake in court, have a better quality of legal representation in court. But as Nathanson puts it, the fact that as a society we're pretty tolerant of the status quo, it really just sort of manifests or signals that we're kind of indifferent to it, that we just really don't care. It's just how the system is and whatever, right? I'm not going to worry about it myself. I'm just going to go with the flow. That kind of indifference, I think, shows that we're really not pro-life when it comes to this matter. Secondly, if we really cared about the value of human life, then we would make sure that comprehensive procedures were followed leading up to a death sentence, right? We'd make sure that there was all kinds of checks and balances that were part of the judicial process itself leading up to a sentence of death by a judge or by a jury. But the fact that race and socioeconomic factors show otherwise really means that, in a sense, again, that we don't care, right? That we are not concerned about those kinds of procedures as a society. And then thirdly, right, if we really cared about the value of human life, then we would care about those who've been wrongly convicted and sentenced. And you might argue that, in a sense, we are caring, that we do care about those wrongly convicted, because after all, every now and then we'll hear a story about new DNA evidence that pops up regarding a case that happened 30 years ago and someone was sent to death row and they've not been executed yet, but they're getting close to their execution date. And so they send the forensic people in and they analyze the DNA evidence, and then they come out and say, this evidence is enough to accuse this person of the crime. It proves that they could have never committed the crime that they were convicted of committing. So indeed, maybe we do care. But what we do know, however, is that for the most part, prosecuting attorneys, that is our county attorneys, are the people who prosecute the cases, who bring up the charges against people and then prosecute them, arguing that they indeed should be convicted. These are who prosecutors are. Generally, they resist reopening cases once those cases have been closed. Once they've won a case, why would they want to open it back up again? Right? Law, especially criminal law, is quite competitive. And we start seeing that. I'm starting to notice that more and more, how competitive that is. Where I kind of wonder if it's at the end of the day, with a lot of these people, if it's really about finding the truth, leaving it at that. If that's the number one overriding concern, or sort of getting the win, just like in football, right? And let's be honest, we live in a very competitive society, especially when it comes to sport. I really do kind of wonder culturally if that spills over. But anyway, I digress, right? Once a case is in the win column for a prosecutor, why open it back up again? This was some of the rationale behind what Texas, I think they still have this. It's kind of old data. Nathanson mentions this. So they may still have this. At least at one time, they had it to where a defendant only had a 60-day time frame to appeal a death penalty conviction. This is something that Texas law had mandated, right? So the Texas state legislature had created this law, had created this policy. Well, that's kind of tough because what happens if new evidence comes to bear 3 years after the date? It's like, oh my gosh, new evidence has come up that could acquit me of a murder that I was wrongly convicted of. But oh crap, in Texas I only have 60 days to appeal. So the new evidence came up too late. Well, that doesn't seem to be right. Now, does it? It seems like, especially with something like the death penalty, if that's what awaits a person, if they're on death row, then surely the entire life that they have yet living should be viable time for introducing new evidence if it were to come up. What if somebody else on their deathbed says, Joe over here was wrongly convicted. I was the one that committed that murder, and confessed to it, and actually provide some evidence that shows that their confession is true. A 60-day appeal deadline should be irrelevant, right? That should be enough to get that person acquitted. So why is that? Why did they even have a 60-day appeal deadline? If they still do, why did they have it to begin with? Because they don't want to open cases back up. Once they're won, and that's it. For the most part, the largest advocates of the wrongly convicted are nonprofit pro bono organizations. Now, what do we mean by that? What does Nathanson mean by that? What he means by that is that when it actually comes to our judicial system and our government, that we don't invest government money at all into trying to figure out and trying to help those who are wrongly convicted. It's private organizations that do this. It's nonprofit organizations where these lawyers work on these cases for people, and they do so for free. They do this research for free. They're not paid. They might get a stipend that sort of covers some of their costs, but they're really not making lawyer money doing this. It's more of out of love and concern and compassion for people, um, that we in our system, and so what Nathanson's saying is that it's a pretty sad state of affairs when our official judicial system itself doesn't invest any resources whatsoever in double checking and in arguing and in advocating for wrongly convicted. That we're leaving that up to other people who have the money to do that or the time to do that, if indeed they will do that. The final point then to all of this that Nathanson wants us to remember is that the death penalty really is more than a judgment. Some philosophers will say, I'm thinking of Louis Poyman in particular, will say something like, the death penalty is just a law in a book that's collecting dust on it in the state capitol that the state legislature had passed many, many years ago. That's all it is. It's a proposition on a piece of paper. It's a written code. It's a law. It's an ordinance of the state. What Nathanson's trying to say is that, okay, in one sense that might be right. Technically that might be right. But you have to also recognize that even more than that, the death penalty itself is a system. It's a culture. It's a process that has all of these blemishes that are part of it, and that really should make us reevaluate if we should have it at all. Right? If all of these kinds of features and factors are going on with how we do the death penalty, that may indeed be in our best interest and in the best interest of our society, indeed in the best interest of justice and morality, given his first argument about how wrong he thinks that death penalty is in theory, that is. That if it has all of these flaws and blemishes to it that are pretty severe, then it might be best to just do away with it altogether. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and are thinking really hard at this topic. Thank you so much for your time, and we will see you next time.